So the topic today is how disgusting is celery juice?
I mean, what's the going rate on grass water?
We did a podcast on marijuana, but that is not the same grass.
It looks like you milked a vegan cow.
You have to detox your body more often when you're older, when you did things in your past that you weren't supposed to.
Some things just aren't supposed to be juice.
Yeah.
And the celery is one of those things.
Absolutely. So for those,
potato juice, like what is that?
For those listening that are thoroughly confused, yes, this is still the Ignite Church Community Podcast, and it is our goal to equip, inform, and challenge you. And right now we're challenging Pastor Jen because she has celery juice.
It was made in San Diego. So
wow. So that makes it.
Yeah.
That makes it.
Are you
so
trying to make
better.
it worse? Or are you telling me San Diego?
Guys, in all fun, my name is Stephen Dupree. I'm your host today. I'm joined by Pastor Josh, Pastor Jen, if you couldn't tell that already. We're going to have a fun time today. The day's going to be a unique podcast where we're going to talk a little bit about not growing up in church, which, spoiler alert, neither of you guys did. Correct?
What?
So this conversation I feel like is super helpful, but especially in a church like ours. But I feel like as we move forward as a country, more and more and more, what you see statistically wise is people not claiming a religion. They don't want to be associated necessarily with being a Christian. Whereas in our past as a nation, especially you go back 50 years, most people identified as Christian, and most people had some sort of church experience in general. But yeah, that is not the case more and more and more. And so interacting with your friends or family or people that you're trying to just love in general that did not grow up in church is going to be more and more and more common, I feel like. And so that's something what we wanted to just talk about it. So start us off, guys. Tell us a little bit about your experience growing up, not in church. What did you hate? What did you love about it? Just all the things.
Well, not a lot of tithes.
Yeah. Bad joke to start out with. You thought it was great, though.
I mean, you kept... Yeah, sorry. Okay. So technically, I grew up in some kind of organized religion, right?
True. You're a little. You're an outlier.
So, as Jehovah's Witness church, maybe you could call it. But I would say we're just giving our background. Yeah,
give your background and like.
Yeah, so I grew up in Jehovah's Witness church, which is very structured. They don't have. They do not have pastors.
Okay.
They have elders. So kind of like deacons, but all of them are expected to preach. Okay. And so what that meant is on any given Sunday, you could have an extremely, extremely boring word from someone who this is not their job. But the beautiful thing about it is, in some ways, is that everyone is expected to be able to give the word. So there's some commendable things there. But yeah, so it was Sunday, Wednesday, and Thursday. There was 3 nights out of the week. Very, very works-based as far as strict. Could not associate with people really outside of that faith. And then, of course, that leads to, as soon as I get a car, as soon as I'm able, I mean, just... crazy wild.
Like those reality TV shows where like the kids turn 18 and they can leave the Amish culture for like a year and then they get to choose if they come back or not. And they're always like, peace, see ya.
Yeah. As soon as I was...
growing up Amish, yeah.
As soon as I didn't have to churn butter anymore, it was like churning other stuff.
Yeah, I know you personally, so I've heard a lot of like your history and things like that. There's a lot that goes into growing up in a Jehovah's Witness household.
For sure.
You didn't have birthdays. You didn't have holidays.
Yeah.
So it's really sad. You just had a terrible job.
Never had celery juice. Never experienced the world.
Okay. Pastor Jen, completely different experience for you.
Yeah.
Tell us about it.
So how do I best describe my childhood? I would say that I lived in many different states across the country. We were a very transient, I believe, is a great word, family. We moved around every 2 to 3 years. So
Not like gypsies, but just barely.
Pretty much,
Okay.
yeah. So I was born in Santa Ana, California. Anyways, we lived everywhere from Arizona to Kansas to Hawaii to you name it.
Why'd you leave Hawaii?
No. So I would say that in the beginning, my mom and my immediate family would somewhat go to church. We did a little bit when I was very much younger, but I don't have very many memories of that.
Okay.
What I do remember is through some divorces and what my mom had walked through, we actually got kicked out of a church. Which was really scarring. And I remember from that point afterwards being I would have, quote unquote, my Christian friends, and I would have very much my school friends that were very different. And I didn't ever, it was never required of me to go to church. I would kind of bop in and bop out every once in a while. There used to be a youth program that all the kids would hang out at and stuff like that I would go and check out. But yeah, no, there was never really any structure from junior high on. I did whatever I wanted to do. I had tons of friends.
So there was no expectation of your parents to for you to be in church at all?
Yeah, no.
None of that. No, that's great. That's good. So if you guys could say what's one thing you really loved about not growing up in a Christian church, what would you say? And this can be totally selfish. It doesn't have to be real. But growing up, what's one thing you just loved about growing up, how you grew up?
That's a great question.
I mean,
Did you not love anything?
For me, it's I want to say, I didn't have to go to church on Sundays and I got to sleep in. But wait a minute. No, I still did. Okay, so if you're listening to this, I still did. I just didn't get birthdays of Santa Claus. So think about all the things you don't like about church, right? As a kid, but none of the great things, like Santa Claus. I'm just kidding. No, I mean, for me, I think it would have been a lot differently if I did not necessarily understand church culture, and for some things I think that could be a positive. You're not stuck in any kind of traditions, and in some ways you're wary of traditions, you would say, probably. I'm that's a healthy thing. There's nothing good I can say about it as a kid, but now looking back, it's good. I think there's positives of the fact that we may get into it, but I don't have any of the preconceived ideas of traditional church or brainwashed in a sense of that. I was obviously given a different kind of religion, but I don't have any preconceived I grew up in this church and this is how you do it.
That's cool.
I think for me, definitely the independent. So it's a good and a bad thing, right? I wish I didn't have as much independence and freedom as I had growing up, looking back now that I'm a mom and all those different things. So, but during that time, I very much took advantage of being able to do whatever I wanted to do. And it was interesting. I think for someone like me and a lot of other listeners out there who did kind of not grow up with the requirement to go to church or be a part of things, I always found myself attracted to kind of what church looked like, or different type of the youth programs, or kind of what was going on. What I found interesting, and I even dated some of the guys or whatever, is that very much so most of the time the people that profess to believe to be Christians or whoever did not live that lifestyle out to be true. But in the same token, I liked what they were saying.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, they're saying a message of hope. ultimately.
Yeah.
And that's attractive no matter who you are.
Yeah.
I could see that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So to try to have this conversation go a little further, deeper. So what are some things today you observe that people do, people say, that didn't grow up, or that grew up? Let me read my question right. So people that did not grow up in church, what are things that they say where it makes you cringe a little bit because now that you've experienced church, you've been in church, and you're thinking back oh man, I remember going down that road. That's not a road you want to go down. What are some of those things that you would say to people that are outside of church? And what are some of those things you hear people saying man, you shouldn't say that. You're missing it.
Yeah, I hope I'm going the right way with this because
it is a little. I'm sorry. My question is a little very confusing.
I do think that now, when I look at my son who's 5 and his peers, there's a lot of kids that do not go to church now.
Yeah.
Right? You're right in saying that when I was younger, I was the abnormal one for not going to church. In fact, I remember as a teenager when I could drive going to church with my girlfriends because their parents weren't going to let them be with some guy who wasn't going to church. And so for me, I was just selfish. So I'm like, sure, I'll show up and go with you and whatever. Yeah. And there's so many we could talk about experiences. It's I remember the first time seeing a communion and being like, what is going on here, right? And so the church doesn't think about those things, and that could be part of this podcast. But one thing that I see is people saying, well, I don't go to church. I have a spiritual relationship with Jesus, or I have Jesus is my friend. I love Jesus. I believe in Jesus, but I just don't go to church. And for me, I get it. I really do. But at the same time, I think that most of the people that say that have failed to understand why we go to church.
Okay.
And then by that, I mean, they don't realize that, and maybe it's part of growing up in church that you neglect what it is. I don't know. I mean, maybe that is something that is missing, or maybe some of these churches people have grown up in, that's really how it was received, that it's a checkbox, right? That it's some kind of you're a Christian, you go to church. And I don't believe that is why to go to church. Yeah. I go to church because I don't think that you can live this life well and what God intended to you without being around like-minded people, worshiping God together. There's something so special about that. I don't find it to be legalistic checkbox. I find it to be an example of what was in Scripture. They just gathered. That's what they did. And it's when you try to do this outside of community, being Christian is not easy, and it's not supposed to be easy. That's why it takes community and people. So one that drives me crazy, I think, is oh yeah, I believe in Jesus. I'm just not into the church thing. Well, it's that's part of believing in Jesus, is being with like-minded people. I'm not saying you have to have a building. Even if you're meeting at, house churches, that's a church. That's a like-minded fellowship, but you got to have that community.
Yeah. You said that first thing about communion. It just made me think I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and I just wish I could go back in time and have you come to one of those services where everybody just starts speaking in tongues, and just how I just want to watch your face. That would have been so great to see young Josh in that context.
I mean, I've been to some things. I've been to some with girls, and it was holy moly, this is so boring. And I've been to some where, I think of we're singing, and all of a sudden they skip a verse in the songbook, and everybody looks at me like I was supposed to know that you skip an entire verse.
Yeah,
that doesn't make normal sense to skip a verse. Why did that person write it? Why did he just not write 3?
Everybody universally agrees. Either that second or third verse.
It makes about as much sense as celery juice.
Probably. That's just another constant theme in this podcast. Well, what about you, Pastor Jen?
So I think one of the most interesting things when I first gave my life over to Jesus in Southern California, when I first started going to church, the church that I went to allowed space for me to be able to sit in the back row. and allowed space for me to be able to kind of meander my way in and let me hear and sing the songs or not sing the songs or just kind of watch what was happening. Because at that point, I don't think I had stepped foot in a church for, over 10 years it had been. In between. I can remember one of the times, and my husband and I were separated at the moment. And I've talked about that story before, but beforehand, my husband is a pastor's kid, right? So completely different experience.
Yeah.
And when we first met, I remember him taking me to go visit the church that him and his mom went to and his dad. And it was this big ordeal. Like, I felt very much like I had the attention on me and everybody had to come out and meet me and I needed to sit in a certain spot. And so I think the weird thing when we get even new visitors sometimes, or we get people that are just want to check it out, we have to know who they are, and we've got to make sure we say hi, and we got to make sure we do all of these things, which I don't think those are bad in of themselves. But I do think that there is a time and a place that we should be sensitive to the fact that people are in different places at different spaces, and sometimes a girl or a guy just needs to be able to walk in the back of a church building and check out God between him and her and God and have a moment to take it all in, because it's a lot.
Yeah.
So that's the weirdest thing for me is like we're called to be. Like Jesus calls us to reach the lost world. Like, how do we do that? But also at the same time, like, how do we be sensitive to the fact that like we don't need to make it weird?
Yeah. I think of like my past in church stuff, and it's like sometimes people come in under the radar, and it's like they intended to do that.
Yes.
They're not trying to bring attention to themselves. They don't want you to clap for them when they come in. They don't want you to stand up. Yeah. They're not gonna flash their flashers to get a front row parking spot because they don't want you to treat them differently. They want to just kind of come in, see what's going on. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of those.
Yeah.
That's great. So that kind of segue a little bit into the next piece that I think would be really cool to talk about, and that is like, what do you think is really important? And this can be, we can go down some rabbit trails here. What do you think are some important things for Christians to be considering, to think about with their friends that have not grown up in church? Like, what are things that like maybe even that we do that are super harmful, that it's like we don't even realize, but we're so caught up in traditions, we're so caught up in phrases or whatever, and it's like we don't even realize it, but we're being almost like antagonistic, to draw someone in even, like what are some things that you guys have observed, and what are maybe some things that people said that were so weird to you, outside the church when they were trying to get you to come, and you're like, why did you say that to me? Yeah.
I mean, gosh, man. So many things. Like one that'll always be huge in my heart, and I'm so thankful that God has allowed me to be a part of a church where I don't have to worry about this, is the whole attitude that I saw sometimes when I was lost of, man, if he would just start doing good things, then he could come to church and he would get better, right?
Wow.
Instead of like, no, let's just bring lost Josh, lost whoever to church and let them encounter Jesus and let him work on their heart. Like, I cannot stand the idea of like, let's make church people to bring them to church instead of let's bring lost people to church. That's one of them. I have other. I don't know if you want to chime in first.
No, I agree with that first one big time. I think that number one, not just bringing church people to church, but being able to understand that if you do have someone that's in your community or your church or your small group or whatever that hasn't been to church in years, right? And they are kind of just checking it out. We might not need to ask a lot of questions right off the bat. They might not need to have all the answers, but then when they are ready to share their story, I can remember sharing my story and almost pausing and getting uncomfortable, because you can tell immediately when people are like, oh, she's got a
past.
she's got a past, right?
She got like
She's
a
one of
real.
those.
She's got like a real past, and
She drinks celery juice.
we get legitimately uncomfortable in messy people telling messy things.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what we're supposed to be comfortable in. We all have messy past. Every single one of us is a sinner from one spectrum to another.
Mm-hmm.
We've got to be able to figure it out. Like, maybe I don't need to say anything in this moment. Maybe I just need to listen to someone else's story, empathize, and do whatever I can to make her or him feel welcome. I agree 1,000% on that one. Yes, I could go on about that.
And then another part of me was like, I wish, I'm trying to think, because I went to church so many times with people where it meant nothing. Like, I've told my testimony of where it started to mean something, and with Cam and all that stuff that went down, and like that was when it started to mean something. But I want people to know I went to church many one-off times before that with, like I said, girlfriends or friends, and the things that never stuck are, first off, like, I can't emphasize enough what it means when I say never been to church, right? People do not like feeling uncomfortable. You mentioned the back.
Mm-hmm.
When they start saying like everyone stand or something, like, I need someone to make me feel comfortable about what is going to happen at church, or you know, communion. They should have never let me take communion. Why did they let me? Why?
Yeah.
You know, it's just and that leads to one of the other things is a lot of times the people that bring them to church, it was very it felt very fake, because they did not live out anything that would make me think they believed in Jesus. And so it always felt like, oh, this is just something you do, right? In the South, you go to church. And it's like you do this for other people, so other people will know that you're not a bad person. But then when you leave here, you do whatever you want to do.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that really drives me nuts, and that I hope that we're all careful, and I can remember too, when I first started, I became a Christian, I surrendered my life, I was trying to work on all of these different things. Like, it's a complete worldview shift, right? Jesus has immediate implications, not only for myself, but for my husband, for my children. And I was going to counseling at the time, and I was involved in a small group of ladies who I'm still friends with to this day. They're amazing. Awesome. But I was told to get some resources. So I went to a Christian bookstore, and I went and picked up
oh, goodness.
Idle Lies or something, like really dark, and How to Survive an Affair, like all of these deep like things that you have, like, real people go through, especially if they haven't been in church and stuff like that. And I can remember the person in front of me, and this is in Southern California, a completely different culture than Bible Belt or East, you know. And I remember watching the interaction in front of me of this gentleman who was purchasing a King James Bible, who was getting his name engraved on the Bible. And the woman who was a Christian was very much comfortable and, hi, how you doing? Oh, have a blessed day, and all this kind of stuff. And then I remember me and my gang, and Caitlin and Chloe were little, and my husband was kind of next to me, kind of not, because we were kind of learning how to family again. And I remember going up there and putting down my resources and trying to get my kids who were messing up the back of the Veggie Tales and stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely.
And her whole demeanor changed. Like,
you weren't the nice, pretty church person.
No. And I still, I think we do that sometimes unintentionally, and even still it brings a little bit of emotion to me, because I really, we have me come through our doors every single day that are needing resources to be able to talk about our marriages, just the different problems that we're going through. How can we give them resources and tools that will help them as people, but ultimately that will bring them closer to God without turning around and making that treatment of the person in front of me very different than what I experienced. She literally maybe said 2 words to me. Wow. And then I remember leaving feeling completely guilted and shamed. Yeah. And that's so different from what I experienced surrendering my life to Jesus, right?
Yeah. But sometimes it can be hard to disassociate. Like, you know, I've had this great experience, but these other people that are in these circles that seem to follow him, the same Jesus, they don't treat me how I feel like we should be treating one another, kind of thing.
Yeah. Who said, I like your Jesus, I just don't like your Christians or the Jesus followers? It's
I think that was Gandhi.
Somebody.
Did Gandhi say that?
I don't know who said it.
I don't know if it's
Jen
like
doesn't know. No one knows. She's the quote
I'm pretty
master.
sure it's like, I like your Jesus, I don't like
your Jesus followers.
Something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I do feel I definitely have had similar experiences to that. Even growing up in a small town, it was like, he's not Christian, and you stay away from him. And it's like the people that were Christian were way worse, right? And it's like, man, this is a ridiculous religion. Is how I felt growing up, right? It's just and what you don't realize is that the scripture in Matthew about there being a narrow road to salvation and a broad and spacious road to destruction is also in the church. There's plenty of hypocrites in the church, but that is not God's kingdom, right? And then you can also be a good person and not a Christian. It's about recognizing you're bad. But one of the things that I was very appreciative of is when I gave my life to Christ, there was so many things I had to continue to work through, and the way people did that was very gently and not like, oh, you gave your life to Christ, here's what you need to get rid of now, and here's what you need to fix in your life. It was more of what you see in scripture with Jesus and his love for people. And it was like, instead of where I was growing up with the rules, it felt like, man, Jesus did this for me, I want to be more like him. And it was a slow, I wish I could say like, I got baptized and all my sin was gone, but it was a sanctification process that I really am appreciative that people walked through me with, and didn't make me feel like, hey man, you're a Christian now, here's your rule book, so
I think one thing I'm hearing from both of you guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, I heard one speaker put it this way. He was talking about, whenever you are in a situation, especially kind of like you were describing, Jen, where it's like you're in this moment where you're throwing up your life, you finally feel safe enough to share. And like the way this particular speaker put it, he was like, one of the things that I wish every Christian got was the not flinching aspect of Christianity. So it's like, it should not surprise us when people have messy stories and messy pasts. It's like, what will kill their progression is when we start flinching every time they say something that we think is terrible. And it's like, oh my gosh, they did that. Oh. It's like, and every single time you react those ways, that sends a message. It's like, you're not good enough for this. Like oh my gosh. And this particular speaker was talking specifically about reaching celebrities. And it was really cool how he was talking about it. He's like, some of these people, we hold them on such a high pedestal that like who reaches them? They don't just come to church, and like they come to church and people want their autograph. It's like, they're just these elevated humans. And it's like, God forbid they share their story and their brokenness. And it's like, even more so, we need to have people that don't just flinch at sin every time like it's this weird thing that we never encounter. But that sounded like something I was kind of in the middle of everything that made me think of that.
It's a huge counseling principle. When you're counseling someone,
which you have a lot of experience in, for those that don't know.
If you can receive what they're saying as if you love and care about them and are not shocked or do not make faces, because when you make faces, someone picks up that you have judged them, that you are judging what they're telling you. It's amazing the people that would open up in counseling just because they would tell you something thinking they were going to get one reaction, and you would just receive it and be like, I hear what you're saying. And it was like, wait a minute, you're not just shutting down and think I'm evil. And
it's like, that stuff's in the world. Why do we act so shocked about it? In the sense of like, this is, it's like almost like not seeing people as people. You see them as like what they've done, not who they are. That kind of piece.
Well, I realized growing up, and maybe, I don't know if you have the same experience, is one of the things that baffled me was how broken Christians were, but how often they hid it. Like, it was just like, man, you really have this appearance you want to give. but the way you live is not that way. And what was refreshing to me about finally finding Jesus is like, no, you should not be hiding your brokenness. Like, this is part of your story. And I just think in some ways, like, the church in a whole is to blame in some ways of a different, like, culture of, hey, church is the time to have it all together. Like, even the way when I was younger, people would elevate pastors of like, oh, they have it all together. Like, they are the word of God. You do not question them. You know, it's like, no, like, the Bible's the Bible, but we're still people too. Even as a pastor now, I remind myself that.
Yeah. That's good to remember that we have theology for a reason, that we have boundaries and rules for a reason. But if you look at the life of Jesus and how inclusive he was to everybody in the margins, to the least of these, to the sick, to all of that, then we find the correct model of how we interact with people. And we should be the brightest light and some of the most inclusive, welcoming church body while remaining in this theologically correct posture. And to do that, wrestling is very hard, which is why I'm grateful we're having this podcast, because I think it's something that we should continually be talking about, because we can always get better about it.
So kind of shifting gears a little bit, we've been talking a lot to one side of this coin, but you have this other side of coin of people more so kind of in y'all's shoes that did not grow up in church. So I want to speak into a little bit to the group that where you guys are kind of at now. You did not grow up in a Christian church habitually or, regularly for the most part. Yeah. And now you are. Those first years that you were in the church, let's speak to those people. What were the things that were most beneficial to you during that time? What were things that were like, man, you look back now and you're like, I wish I would have done X, Y, Z. I wish I would have like taken this class. I wish I would have, joined a small group, whatever that might be. Just what are some helpful pointers to those people in that stage?
Let me go.
Sure.
I always joke that I am very blessed in that I did not have a very traditional church experience. So, I think when I started going to church, it was this more newer model, a model like we have here at Ignite. In fact, Ignite was, not my first, but my first home church. I got baptized here, always been here, right? And so this was my experience. And so I have not had some of the horror stories that I learned about in seminary of just various churches that are smaller, but that is not always mean a great thing, because interestingly enough, I think for my story, the most growth and spiritual sanctification process, discipline, learning happened from small groups. That's why I love small groups. It was such a pivotal role in my story to be able to have this small group where, kind of like Jen said, where you can trust and you can be broken and share your story with, and to hear them receive that and then hear their brokenness too, made me feel like, okay, this is what it's supposed to look like.
That's great. Now, just to take that a step further, so somebody who is in a situation, maybe they're listening to this and they're like, man, that sounds really awesome. My church isn't big like yours. They don't have small groups. What would be something you would suggest maybe in light of that?
Yeah, it's hard for me because, I'm not, still to this day, I'm not as familiar with smaller churches. Like, I've been blessed to be a part of a larger church, Ignite, been blessed to be called here to work. I've been able to preach some at smaller churches. I think and I never want to advocate for just abandoning a church, right? But I think you have to have that community, and you have to be able to build that small group or accountability in some way with your peers. And if that's not there,
start one.
I was gonna say what I always say to people is, are you the answer to this prayer?
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of people come to me and say, we don't have this small group. Can we start one? And I say, absolutely can. Are you the answer, right? Are you not just part of the need? Are you actually part of the solution?
Absolutely.
And so I would say in that church that doesn't have small groups, like, they need some, right? And so you need to be a part of that. Yeah. If they're opposed to small groups, then wow, that's something really wrong there. But
Well, I think of like in that specific example, like Jesus healing a man that was full of demons, and he's like, I'm going to follow you now. Like, you're the one that healed me. I want to follow you. And he says, no, you can't. Like, you need to stay here and tell people what God's done for you. And he didn't have all the training. He hadn't walked with Jesus to know all the answers. But whenever the disciples come back to that village, they all are like, they're like, there's tons of people that are like waiting for Jesus because they know what's happened in this guy's life. They want to see him. They want to know what he has to say. It's like, that could be in this instance like this. It's like, you might think to yourself based on that, well, yeah, that sounds easy for you to say, start a small group ministry, whatever. Like, how am I even going to talk to the pastor about that? You don't always have to have the answers, but you can just take a step, try to build that community. That's great, man. That's great.
Yeah, and just to add on to that a little bit, like, I know for me it wasn't so much small group, but it kind of was. It was women's Bible studies, and I talk about that a lot. Like, my first group of girls that I'm still friends with, they were very different from my experience in the interaction in the Christian bookstore. They did welcome me in. There was a couple uncomfortable moments, but they constantly were like, hey, I'm sorry, Jen, or how can we get better? Like, you can tell when people are real, but they taught me what it looked like to pray with my kids, how to love my husband more, what it looked like to be a godly Christian woman, and what the central tenets of our faith were. I would say to especially adults who are just becoming Christians, because that's my story. It is very difficult to completely do an absolute world change, and Christianity is that. It's going from death to life, like, but from all of these different things where God has something to say about your finances. He's got something to say about your marriage. He's got something to say about your kids, what you do in your free time, everything in between. And so I would say find your people that are serious about God. So small groups can be one of those. But if your small group is just chilling to hang out and not going anywhere, go find some people that are serious about God that will spiritually grow with you. And then watch what can happen. Like, thank God. I love the story that you told so much, because it's almost kind of like my story and so many that I hope of listeners that can resonate with that. Thank God that Jesus means what he says. Like, I want to not just redeem your life, but restore it. And hey, Jen, even though you were this adult woman that had like every sin that you could possibly think of in your back pocket, I'm the difference that can make you new. And now look, 10 years ago, I would have never imagined that I'd be sitting here across from you, drinking celery juice and being a women's pastor.
Do you eat that or drink it? It's juice, I guess you drink it, but
it's incorrect. That's the only thing that matters is we know it's wrong.
Who knew you would be here 10 years ago?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
There's a couple other things that you're doing that are great as well, outside of celery juice.
It's true.
Just a couple.
Just a couple.
No, you're awesome. You're doing amazing things as the women's pastor. I love that. I think that's great. Are there other things? Because that was just you piggybacking off the other thing.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. So I definitely would suggest, like, and I say it to even Christians of long term, if you want to grow in your faith, you've got to be in your Bible and praying.
What?
Every day. Like, it's so, we're going to go back to, like.
Shocker.
I know. I would say, but how often do we let that slide, or that we go a day or two and then pretty much like it's 2 months that go by? So any way that you can connect with God that is creative and fun. I say it all the time. God is wild. He is much bigger than what we could ever imagine. Lean into that a little bit more. Have fun with it. Say sorry. Treat it like a relationship, and then go after it with all that you have.
That's great. That's awesome. I think, like, one of the things I would add to you guys, I think you kind of had a flavor of it in both of them, was this idea that, like, when you are a new Christian, especially like as an adult, I feel like even more so, there is this like sponge effect that takes place, where like you go through this period of time where everything is fresh and new and you're absorbing so much. Like, I think a big thing is like not to take that time for granted. Like, there's going to come time where it feels like you're too busy for that. Those times are going to come when life tries to hit you again. And it's like, I mean, like, man, I was so on fire and I didn't really take advantage of that time whenever I just made time. It's like a new relationship. You make time for stuff. That happens a lot of times whenever you have like new Christians that come to faith. And so if you're in those shoes, like I think that's something you guys are both kind of hitting at, that just take advantage of that time, whether it's a class, a small group, Bible study. You need community. That's definitely a big thing. But yeah, it's a great time. You're just soaking in and learning a lot. Well, guys, this has been fun. This has been great. I don't have any more questions, but like takeaways for you guys, like if you could just kind of glean one little nugget from this that you would want to leave with. And we've talked a little bit about kind of both sides of the coin, either people that are trying to minister to someone who did not grow up in church, or someone that did not grow up in church that's maybe not in church still, or has started coming to church. Like, what's a nugget that you would like to pull out from stuff we talked about and just highlight before we finish up?
I would say this is for everyone, if whether you grew up in church or whether you're like myself and Jen now, where you found Christ as an adult. No matter, and even now, I've been a Christian long enough where I have to do this. We have got to remind ourselves what it's like to not have Jesus, right? To remember what it's like to have Jesus, or think about what's your life. If you grew up in church, what would your life be like if you did not know Jesus, if you did not know his love, his goodness, his faith was not there for you, and how empty that feeling is. And for me, I cannot forget that, because as soon as I forget that, it is so much easier to judge other people and to look at yourself as above them, when really you're just as broken as them. You just have something that they don't, possibly. And like that should bring you not to judge them, but to
want to share
desire for them to have that. And so when I remind myself, I think about my friends that don't, and I'm like, I don't sit there and think, man, they're such bad people. I think, man, gosh, if they could just have this, if they could just get this, they could have peace, man. I don't feel anger at them. I feel genuine, like, just come on, man, you can have this. Like, and that is such a different attitude. And I just wish, if you can get anything away from this podcast, is like, think about that. If you're like us, think about when you didn't have him. If you've always had Jesus, think about what your life would be like if you were raised with parents that did not know Christ. If you did not know Jesus, what would your life be like?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, that's so big, because you find yourself attributing things and accomplishments to yourself that really is the grace of God in your life. And
Absolutely.
You just need to take time and do some inventory and realize you're not as awesome as you think you are. That's so huge. That's like a big piece of my story for sure. What would you?
For the grace of God,
Yeah.
So I would say two things. I think number one, be comfortable in the margins, be comfortable in the mess. For those of you who have not grown up in church, for those of you who have grown up in church, sorry. When you've got new visitors coming through, you're meeting new people, maybe not speak for the first bit, just listen and watch yourself, like your facial expressions, your reactions, all that kind of stuff. If you're giving off a vibe of empathy or welcomeness, or not that. And I think for my friends that are listening, that are in the margins right now, you're obviously listening for a reason. Maybe you didn't grow up in church and you're just checking out this thing that we call Christianity, and this man that we say Jesus and that we love, that who is our Savior. And I would say lean in a little bit more. Keep asking questions. Don't ever stop being curious. I think that God knows when our hearts are open and when we're ready. And just like both of you said, his grace is beyond anything we could ever think of or imagine. And if you want to get me fired up and talk about that, we could talk about that forever.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that's so true. And I think it's kind of like what you started with originally. It's like one of the things that you always said before coming to church is like, there is something attractive about that hope. Just dive into that, like head first. Like, lean into that. Maybe not so much the bad experiences you've had. think more about like, where is the nugget that I can pull from this?
But he's used all those things, even the bad experiences, for good. That's what his grace does, which is really cool.
That's awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for this conversation. This was a great one. We've had so many good podcasts lately, and you know what?
And we're matching.
It is. Where's my carrot juice?
Well, if you're watching this and you are listening to this and you're like, man, I've been listening to all these great podcasts on the Ignite Community Podcast. You know what you need to do? I'm looking at you right now on the camera and I'm talking to you right now on the microphone. You need to rate this podcast 5 stars. Amazing content. And if you hate it, rate it 5 stars just to spite us.
Yeah, that'll really get us.
That really will get under
I
our
hate
skin.
it when they do that.
Yeah, and that will be amazing. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you're watching this on YouTube, Facebook, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think about this episode. Let us know other things you'd like for us to talk about. If you're not on YouTube or Facebook and you want to let us know of a topic that you'd like to hear us talk about, maybe something like this, something different, let us know that at podcast@ignitechurch.com. Really love to hear from you there. We'd love to do a Q&A at some point with a bunch of different random tidbits. So leave us some love there. But until then, we hope you guys have a great day, great week. Until next time at the Ignite Church Community Podcast.
Peace out.
Peace out.